I've seen all kinds of things on the road. Crazy weather, near-death accidents, and strange people at truck stops. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could prepare me for what happened on Route 55. It started as a regular haul. I was driving through a stretch of highway in the Midwest, a route I'd taken many times before. My cargo was unremarkable, just some pallets of canned goods destined for a distribution center. The trip was supposed to take about 8 hours. I planned to drive through the night and be at the delivery point by morning. The night was calm, the road empty, except for the occasional headlights of another vehicle passing by. The hum of my truck's engine was soothing, and the familiar feel of the steering wheel in my hands made me feel in control. But then, as I approached a section of the highway bordered by dense woods, things started to feel off. First, my radio cut out. No static, no signal, just silence. I fiddled with the knobs, but nothing worked. It was strange, but I shrugged it off. These things happen in the middle of nowhere. Then my GPS lost signal too. The screen went blank, leaving me with nothing but the old paper map I kept in the glove compartment as a backup. The road ahead seemed darker than usual, as if the moonlight couldn't quite penetrate the trees. My headlights barely illuminated more than a few feet ahead, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift in ways that didn't feel natural. About 30 minutes later, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure stood on the side of the road, right where the asphalt met the gravel shoulder. It was a woman, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned dress, the kind you'd see in black and white photos. She wasn't hitchhiking. She just stood there, staring at my truck as I approached. I slowed down, my instincts telling me to be cautious. As my truck drew closer, I noticed her face. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her skin was pale, almost gray. She didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the roar of my truck's engine passed her. I didn't stop. Something about her presence sent chills down my spine. I told myself it was just some lost woman, maybe someone trying to scare drivers for fun. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. About 5 miles down the road, I saw her again. The same woman, standing in the same spot, wearing the same expression. My heart pounded in my chest. There was no way she could have gotten there before me. I kept driving, gripping the wheel tightly. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe the fatigue was playing tricks on me. But when I saw her a third time, standing in the middle of the road this time, I slammed on the brakes. My truck skidded to a stop, the tires screeching against the asphalt. She didn't move. She stood there, staring at me, her head tilted slightly to one side. I honked the horn, the sound echoing into the night. And then she smiled. It wasn't a kind smile, it was cold, menacing. Her lips stretched unnaturally wide, revealing teeth that looked sharp, almost predatory. She raised one hand and pointed at me, her finger shaking as if she were struggling to keep it steady. That's when the lights on my truck flickered and died. The engine sputtered and stopped, leaving me in complete darkness. I sat frozen in my seat, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My flashlight was in the glove compartment, but I didn't dare reach for it. My eyes were glued to the windshield, where the woman still stood, her smile growing wider. And then she started to move. She didn't walk, she glided, her feet never touching the ground. She moved closer and closer, her face coming into clearer view. Her eyes weren't just wide, they were empty, black voids that seemed to suck in the darkness around her. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, aiming it at her. The beam of light hit her face, and she let out a blood-curdling scream. It was a sound I'll never forget, like a mix of a human scream and the wail of an animal in pain. And then she was gone. The lights on my truck flickered back to life, and the engine roared to life as if nothing had happened. I didn't waste a second. I slammed the truck into gear and drove as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. For the rest of the trip, I didn't see her again, but the feeling of being watched never left me. When I finally reached the distribution center, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I told the workers there what had happened, expecting them to laugh it off or tell me I was crazy. But one of them, an older man with a weathered face, looked at me with a grim expression. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked. "Who?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The woman of Route 55, he said. "She's been haunting that stretch of road for years. They say she was killed in an accident there, back in the 1950s. A trucker hit her and kept going. Now she appears to drivers who pass through, looking for the one who ended her life." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, unloaded my cargo, and left as quickly as I could. To this day, I avoid Route 55 whenever possible. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I catch a glimpse of a figure in the distance, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, watching and waiting. And I pray she doesn't find what she's looking for. For weeks after that night on Route 55, I couldn't shake the memory of the woman. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her empty, black voids of eyes staring into me. Sleep became difficult. Even when I was at home, away from the truck and the open road, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like she was somewhere in the room, watching. But I had bills to pay, so I couldn't stop driving. The company I worked for assigned me different routes, and I stayed as far away from Route 55 as I could. Life slowly went back to normal, or at least I tried to convince myself it did. Then a few months later, my dispatcher called me into the office. "Got a big haul for you," he said, tapping a map spread across his desk. "The usual drivers are tied up, and you're one of the few I trust with this load." I looked at the route. My stomach dropped. It cut straight through Route 55. "Can't you give this to someone else?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He raised an eyebrow. "Come on, you're not scared of a little stretch of road, are you? It's the fastest way to get there. Besides, the company's offering a bonus for this one." I wanted to refuse. Every part of me screamed to say no, but when he mentioned the bonus, I hesitated. Money was tight, and that extra cash would help me catch up on bills. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The night I started the trip, everything felt wrong. I packed extra supplies, snacks, a thermos of coffee, and a rosary my mother had given me years ago. Even though I wasn't religious, I told myself it was just another job, but deep down I knew I was lying. The first few hours were uneventful. The highway stretched endlessly before me, the road lit only by my headlights. I played music to keep myself company, trying to drown out the growing unease in my chest. As I approached the familiar stretch of Route 55, the air seemed to grow colder. My breath fogged up the inside of the cab, and I had to turn on the heater. The radio, which had been playing fine, cut out again. I told myself it was just coincidence. Then, in the distance, I saw her. The same woman, standing on the side of the road, her dress fluttering slightly in the wind. She was turned away from me this time, her head bowed as if she were crying. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I pressed down on the accelerator, determined not to stop. As I passed her, she lifted her head and turned to face me. Her eyes were different this time. They weren't empty black voids anymore. They were filled with something worse, rage. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and I felt an overwhelming pressure in my chest, like something heavy was sitting on it. The truck's engine sputtered and died, just like before. I coasted to a stop, the silence deafening. I reached for the rosary hanging from the rearview mirror and clutched it tightly, muttering prayers I hadn't said in years. The cab grew colder, frost creeping up the windows, and then the knocking started. It was faint at first, coming from the passenger side door, a soft rhythmic tap, like someone gently rapping their knuckles. My heart pounded as the sound grew louder, more insistent. I turned to look, and there she was, staring at me through the window. Her face was pressed against the glass, her breath fogging it up. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I rolled down the window just a crack. The cold air rushed in, and I could hear her whispering. "Why didn't you stop?" she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what you mean," I stammered, gripping the rosary so hard it dug into my palm. "You left me," she hissed. "You didn't stop." Her face twisted with anger, and she reached through the window, her hand icy and claw-like. I scrambled back, kicking at the door to close it, but her grip was strong. "Please," I begged. "I don't know who you are." She let out a horrible laugh, a sound that echoed in my ears long after. "You're all the same," she said. "All of you just drive on, leaving me behind." And then, as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. The cab warmed up, the frost melted, and the engine roared back to life. I didn't wait to question it. I slammed the truck into gear and drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I was far away from Route 55. When I got to the delivery point, I couldn't even speak. The workers unloaded the truck and I sat in the cab, shaking. I told my boss I was done with that route, no matter how much money they offered. He didn't argue. He must have seen the fear in my eyes. Since then, I've stayed far away from Route 55, but every now and then, I hear stories from other truckers. They talk about a woman on the side of the road, about strange noises and dead engines, and I know she's still out there, waiting for someone to stop. For the next few months, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't done with me. Even though I avoided Route 55, I'd catch glimpses of her in my side mirrors on other roads, just for a second, standing in the distance, her figure barely visible in the dark. It got to the point where I started avoiding night shifts altogether, even though the pay was better. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I pulled into a truck stop near the state line. It was one of those spots where the coffee tasted burnt and the diner smelled like grease, but it was a familiar place, and familiarity was comforting. I sat at the counter, nursing a cup of black coffee, when an older trucker slid onto the stool next to me. He looked like he'd been on the road for decades, grizzled beard, weathered face, and a jacket that had seen better days. "You look like you've seen her," he said without any preamble, his voice low and gravelly. I nearly choked on my coffee. "What did you say?" "The woman," he said, stirring sugar into his own cup, "on Route 55. You've seen her, haven't you?" I stared at him, unsure whether to deny it or come clean. He must have seen the answer in my face, because he nodded grimly. "You're not the first," he said. "Won't be the last either. She's been haunting that road for years, maybe decades." "Why me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I didn't do anything to her. I wasn't even on that road the first time she died." He shrugged. "Doesn't matter. She's not after the one who hit her. She's after anyone who drives through her territory. Sometimes she just watches. Sometimes," he trailed off, his eyes darkening, "sometimes she takes." "Takes?" I asked, my stomach twisting into knots. "Drivers disappear," he said simply. "Their rigs found abandoned, sometimes with the engine still running, but no sign of the driver. Gone without a trace." I felt a chill run down my spine. What am I supposed to do? He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You've got to put it to rest. Find out who she was, how she died, and then," he hesitated, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup, "and then you've got to give her what she wants." "What does she want?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Closure," he said. "Justice, or maybe revenge. Hard to say with spirits like her." I left the truck stop that night with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: I couldn't keep running from this. If I didn't do something, she'd keep haunting me, and maybe one day I'd be one of those drivers who just vanished. The next day, I started digging. I went to libraries, searched online, and asked around at truck stops. It took weeks, but I finally pieced together her story. Her name was Lila Harper. She'd lived in a small town near Route 55 in the 1950s. One night, she was walking home from a friend's house when a trucker hit her and drove off. She lay on the side of the road for hours before anyone found her. By then, it was too late. The driver was never caught, and Lila's death was ruled an accident. But some locals believe she stayed behind, unable to move on because her story wasn't finished. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to return to Route 55. It was the last thing I wanted to do, but I didn't see any other way. If I wanted my life back, I had to confront her. I prepared carefully. I loaded my truck with candles, a small wooden cross, and a photo of Lila that I'd found in an old newspaper article. I wasn't sure what I was doing, but the old trucker at the diner had given me some advice. Treat her like a person, not a ghost. Speak to her, apologize, and give her something to hold on to. That night, I parked my truck on the shoulder of Route 55, right near the spot where Lila had died. The road was eerily quiet, the trees casting long twisted shadows under the moonlight. I stepped out of the cab, clutching the photo and the cross. My breath fogged in the cold air as I lit the candles, placing them in a circle around me. "Lila," I called out, my voice shaky, "I know you're here." For a moment nothing happened. Then the air grew colder, and a faint figure appeared in the distance. She walked toward me slowly, her dress billowing around her, her face pale and expressionless. "I'm sorry," I said, holding up the photo. "I'm sorry for what happened to you. You didn't deserve it." She stopped a few feet away, her empty eyes fixed on me. "You all just drive," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind. "You never stop. You never care." "I'm stopping now," I said. "I care. I'm here to help you. Please tell me what you want." She just stared at me. Then she pointed to the photo in my hand. "Remember me," she said softly. "Don't let them forget." Her voice was filled with sorrow, not anger. I felt a lump in my throat as I nodded. "I promise," I said. Her figure began to fade, her form dissolving into the night. The air grew warmer, the oppressive feeling lifting. I stayed there for a while, staring at the spot where she'd disappeared. I don't know if I gave her what she needed, but I haven't seen her since. To this day, I keep Lila's photo in my truck, tucked into the sun visor. Every now and then, I think about her and the countless others like her, forgotten souls left behind on the road, and I make sure to always keep my promise. After that night on Route 55, I drove back to the truck stop where the old-timer had spoken to me. I wanted to tell him what had happened, to share the strange mix of fear and relief that was still sitting heavy in my chest. But when I asked around, no one seemed to know who I was talking about. The diner staff swore up and down that no one matching his description had been in there for months. It unsettled me, but I decided to let it go. Maybe he'd moved on, or maybe I'd just imagined the whole conversation in my sleepless haze. Either way, it felt like the chapter with Lila was closed. I stuck to new routes after that. Every so often, another trucker would bring up the stories about Route 55, about the woman in the old-fashioned dress who appeared out of nowhere. I never shared my experience, not because I didn't believe it, but because I wasn't sure anyone else would. Still, I couldn't completely let go. Lila's photo stayed in my truck, a constant reminder of that night. Sometimes, when I'm parked in the middle of nowhere and the wind howls through the trees, I glance at it and wonder if she's truly at peace. I never saw her again, not on Route 55 or anywhere else, but every now and then, when I'm driving late at night, I swear I can feel her presence, not angry, not vengeful, just there, watching. And maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. Some people say the road is haunted, but I think it's more than that. The road remembers. It remembers the lives lost, the tragedies forgotten by everyone, except the asphalt itself. For now, I keep driving, 1 mile at a time. I don't think I'll ever forget what happened, but maybe that's the point. Some stories are meant to stay with you, not as a curse, but as a reminder to care, to notice, and to stop when someone needs help. Because out there on the highway, in the endless stretch of dark, lonely roads, we're all ghosts of someone. My name's Jake, and I've been a trucker for 15 years. Driving all day, sometimes all night, I've seen my share of odd things. But this one trip, it still gives me chills. I was hauling a shipment of auto parts from Chicago to Denver, a solid 2-day drive if I pushed it. The dispatcher warned me about an incoming storm, but deadlines don't care about bad weather. I had a job to do. The first day was uneventful, just me, my truck, and the open road. But by nightfall, something felt wrong. I was on a back road to avoid construction, and the radio kept cutting out, leaving me with just static. It was pitch dark outside, no street lights, no other cars, just the sound of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional howl of wind. As the miles ticked by, I spotted something in my side mirror, headlights. At first I felt relieved. At least I wasn't alone on this desolate road. But then I noticed the lights never got closer. They just hovered in the distance, always the same distance behind me, no matter how fast or slow I went. I decided to pull over at a small, run-down rest stop to clear my head. It wasn't much, just a bathroom, a vending machine, and an old payphone. I got out of the truck, stretched, and glanced back at the road. The headlights were gone. Inside the bathroom, the flickering fluorescent light added to the eerie vibe. I washed my hands and splashed cold water on my face, trying to shake off the unease. When I stepped out, I noticed a man leaning against my truck. He was tall, wearing a tattered jacket and a trucker hat pulled low over his face. Something about him didn't feel right. "Long night, huh?" he said, his voice gravelly. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my distance. "You need something?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, his eyes dark and hollow. "You're on the wrong road, driver. You should turn around." I chuckled nervously. "Can't do that, buddy. Got a schedule to keep." He stepped closer, and I instinctively reached for my pocket knife. "Deadlines don't matter where you're going," he muttered, almost to himself. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, he turned and walked into the woods, vanishing into the shadow. Shaken, I climbed back into my truck and locked the doors. The rest of the night, I couldn't shake the man's words. Who was he? What did he mean? By midnight, the storm hit. Heavy rain pounded the windshield, and lightning lit up the sky. My GPS lost signal, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. I kept driving, hoping to find a familiar highway. That's when I saw it, an old broken-down truck on the side of the road. Its hazard lights blinked weakly, and steam rose from the hood. Normally, I'd stop to help, but something told me to keep going. As I passed, I swore I saw someone sitting in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead. Their face was pale, almost glowing in the dark. Around the road changed. The asphalt turned to gravel, and thick fog rolled in, swallowing everything in its path. My headlights barely cut through it. That's when I noticed shadows moving in the mist. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but then I saw them, other trucks, dozens of them, moving in eerie silence. Their headlights flickered like candle flames, and their engines made no sound. I tried to honk my horn, but no sound came out. My truck slowed on its own, no matter how hard I pressed the gas. The ghostly convoy surrounded me, their drivers staring blankly ahead, their faces pale and lifeless. When the fog finally cleared, I was back on the same stretch of road I'd driven hours earlier. The rest stop appeared again, exactly as it had been before, down to the flickering light in the bathroom. My clock showed 9 p.m., the same time I'd stopped there the first time. It didn't make sense. I checked my logbook and saw the same times written over and over, like I'd been driving in a loop. I decided to call for help, but my phone had no signal, and the payphone was dead. Desperate, I turned the truck around, only to see the headlights from before reappear in my mirror. As I drove, the road seemed to narrow, the trees closing in on either side. I heard whispers, faint at first, then louder, like a crowd was following. I looked in the mirror and saw figures standing along the roadside, their faces blank and expressionless. Up ahead, the man from the rest stop stood in the middle of the road, holding up his hand. I slammed on the brakes, my truck skidding to a stop inches from him. "I told you," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "This road isn't meant for the living." Before I could respond, the ground beneath my truck gave way, and I felt myself falling into darkness. I woke up in my truck, parked at a rest area just outside Denver. It was morning, the sun shining brightly. My logbook was blank, and the load I was hauling was gone. When I checked in with dispatch, they told me the delivery was made on time, but no one could explain how I'd gotten there, or what had happened to the last 2 days. To this day, I avoid back roads, especially at night. Sometimes when I'm driving alone, I see those headlights in my mirror, just hovering in the distance. I don't think I'll ever outrun them. After that strange experience, I took a week off. Dispatch wasn't happy about it. but I needed time to clear my head. I stayed home, avoiding my truck entirely, but even there, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At night, I'd hear faint whispers outside my window. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. One evening, I woke up to find dirt and gravel scattered across my living room floor, as if someone had tracked it in. I told myself it was stress. Maybe I'd left the door unlocked. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. A week later, the nightmares began. I dreamed of that endless road, the pale-faced truckers, and the man in the tattered jacket. Every dream ended the same way, with my truck plunging into darkness. Eventually, I had to get back to work. Bills don't pay themselves. My first trip after the break was an easy run, just a short haul to St. Louis. Still, I was on edge, jumping at every sound. For the first few hours, everything was fine. The sun was out, the radio worked, and traffic was light. But as the day wore on, the familiar unease crept back in. Around sunset, I saw a truck on the horizon. It looked old, rusted, like it hadn't been on the road in decades. As I got closer, I noticed the license plate was covered in grime, unreadable. The driver sat stiffly in the cab, their face hidden by shadows. I passed them, but as I glanced in my side mirror, I saw their headlights flicker and then disappear completely. That night, I stopped at a truck stop to rest. It was a larger place, with a diner, showers, and plenty of other drivers around. The bustling atmosphere helped ease my nerves. I struck up a conversation with another trucker, an older guy named Bill. We shared stories over coffee, and I hesitated before bringing up my strange experiences. "You ever see anything weird out there?" I asked. Bill's expression darkened. He set his cup down and leaned in closer. "You're not the first to ask me that," he said. "There's a lot of stories about haunted roads, ghost trucks, things that don't belong in this world. Most folks laugh it off, but I've seen enough to know better." He told me about a stretch of road in the Midwest where drivers vanished without a trace. Their trucks were found abandoned, engines cold, but no sign of the drivers. "Some say it's the ghosts of old truckers who died on the road," Bill said. "Others think it's something older, something that's always been there, waiting." I left the diner more unsettled than ever. That night, I parked in the back corner of the lot and locked my doors. I fell asleep with my knife under my pillow, just in case. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a faint tapping on my window. My heart raced as I reached for the knife. Peering out, I saw nothing but the dimly lit parking lot. The tapping came again, time from the passenger side. I flicked on the cab light, and that's when I saw it, a handprint on the outside of the window. It was smeared, as if someone had dragged their fingers down the glass. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences became more frequent. The headlights in my mirror, the whispers in the wind, the shadows in the corners of my eyes, they were always there. One night, on a quiet stretch of highway, my radio crackled to life. At first, it was static, but then I heard a voice. "Jake." I froze. The voice was faint, distorted, but it was unmistakably saying my name. "Turn back," it said. "Don't make the same mistake." The radio went silent. My headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was the man from the rest stop, his face pale and his eyes hollow. I swerved to avoid him, my truck skidding onto the shoulder. When I looked back, he was gone. I decided to take a break from long hauls, sticking to local deliveries during the day. But even then, the strange occurrences didn't stop. One evening, as I was unloading a shipment, a fellow trucker approached me. He was younger, new to the job, and looked nervous. "You're Jake, right?" he asked. "Yeah, why?" "I heard about you. Some of the guys say you're marked." "Marked?" He nodded. "By the road. Once you've seen it, it never lets you go." I didn't know what to say. Months passed, but the feeling of unease never left. No matter where I drove, I always felt like I was being watched. One night, I woke up to find my truck idling, even though I was sure I'd turned it off. The GPS had a route programmed, a route leading back to the road where it all began. I don't know why, but I followed it. The road was just as I remembered, dark, desolate, and endless. The whispers grew louder, and the headlights reappeared in my mirror. This time, I didn't run. I let them catch up. The ghostly convoy surrounded me, and the man from the rest stop appeared in front of my truck. "You're ready now," he said. "It's time to join the others." The ground beneath me cracked open, and I fell into the darkness once more. I tried, but something was different. The dashboard lights were dim, glowing faintly in a strange blue hue. Outside, the world was shrouded in thick fog, but it wasn't like the mist I'd seen before. It seemed alive, swirling and pulsing as if it had a will of its own. The road ahead was unfamiliar. It wasn't asphalt, but a cracked, uneven surface that shimmered faintly, as if it were wet. The trees on either side were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching toward the road like skeletal fingers. I tried to check my GPS, but the screen was blank. The clock on the dashboard read 0, and the radio crackled with faint whispers, too low to make out. Then I saw them, the trucks from the convoy. They moved in perfect unison, their headlights dim and flickering. Their trailers were rusted, their logos faded beyond recognition. The drivers stared straight ahead, their faces pale and expressionless. I wasn't alone. The convoy moved slowly, and I realized I was part of it. My truck followed though I wasn't pressing the gas. The wheel turned on its own, guiding me down the eerie road. Panic set in. I tried to stop, to turn the wheel, to jump out of the cab, but nothing worked. It was as if the truck had become an extension of me, or maybe I'd become an extension of it. Then I heard the whispers again, louder this time. "Welcome," they said in unison, the voices hollow and echoing. I looked around and saw faces staring at me from the fog, truckers who had been lost to the road. Their eyes were empty sockets, their mouths moving soundlessly. The man from the rest stop appeared again, walking ahead of the convoy. He turned to face me, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "This is where all roads end," he said. "For those who stray too far, who push too hard, the road claims them. It claimed me, and now it's claimed you." "What do you want from me?" I shouted, though my voice sounded weak, swallowed by the fog. "To drive," he said simply. The weight of his words sank in. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a prison, a limbo for those who'd spent their lives on the road, ignoring the warnings, pushing past the limits of the living world. Time became meaningless. Days, nights, they all blurred together in the perpetual twilight of the fog. The convoy drove on, never stopping, never slowing. Occasionally, we'd pass another vehicle, a lone trucker who'd wandered too far onto the wrong road. They'd try to turn around, to escape, but it was always too late. The road always took what it wanted. Sometimes I'd see glimpses of the living world, a brightly lit highway, a bustling truck stop, but I could never reach them. They were like mirages, fading as soon as I got close. One day, or maybe it was night, I noticed something different. A new truck joined the convoy. Its headlights were bright, its trailer clean and modern. The driver looked confused, panicked, just as I had been. I wanted to warn them, to tell them to turn back, but I couldn't. My voice was gone, just like the others. As the new truck fell into formation, I saw the driver glance at me. Their eyes were wide with fear, but they didn't scream. They just stared, silently accepting their fate. And so the convoy grew, one lost soul at a time. I don't know how long I've been here. Days, months, years, it's all the same. The road stretches on, endless and unforgiving. Sometimes I think about my life before, the long hours, the sleepless nights, the constant grind. I wonder if anyone remembers me, if my name is still spoken among the living. But it doesn't matter now. This is my life, or whatever you'd call this existence. The road never ends, and neither does the drive. If you ever find yourself on an empty stretch of highway, with no cars around and no signs of civilization, be careful. If you see headlights in your rearview mirror that never seem to get closer, don't stop, don't pull over, and whatever you do, don't take the back roads at night. because some roads aren't meant for the living. It was one of those nights where the road seemed to stretch on forever, the headlights of the truck slicing through the darkness as I drove down the lonely stretch of highway. My name's Mike, and I've been driving trucks for more years than I care to count. Long-haul trucking was the life I chose, and to be honest, I couldn't imagine doing anything else. But there's something about these late-night runs that makes the world feel a little different. The clock read 2 a.m. as I gripped the steering wheel of my rig, the hum of the tires on the asphalt almost lulling me into a trance. The radio played nothing but static, the kind of static that made you feel like you weren't alone, even when you were in the middle of nowhere. There were no other cars on the road, just the occasional flicker of a distant light from a farmhouse or a small gas station. I was heading down route, an old highway that had seen its fair share of stories. They say that the road's got a life of its own, and on nights like these, I wondered if they were. I'd heard the rumors about this stretch of highway. The truckers in the lot at the diner back in the last town talked about it. They said there were places on that road where you could see things that weren't there, or hear voices on the wind. Some of them swore they had experienced it themselves, but I didn't buy into the ghost stories. I was just trying to make it to my next stop and get some sleep, but tonight was different. As I passed through a particularly dark stretch of road, I noticed something up ahead, a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just another hitchhiker, but something felt off. I slowed the truck down, squinting to get a better look. The figure was tall, too tall for a normal person, and its movements, they weren't natural. I couldn't explain it, but I had this strange feeling in my gut, the kind of feeling you get when you know something bad is about to happen. But I couldn't just leave a person standing out here, could I? I pulled the truck to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as I rolled to a stop. My heart was pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring into the darkness, as though it was waiting for something or someone. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and opened the door. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face. I glanced back at the figure, but it hadn't budged. "Hey!" I called out. My voice echoed down the empty road. "You need a ride?" There was no response, just the wind rustling through the trees. I took a cautious step toward the figure, my boots crunching on the gravel as I moved closer. And then it happened. The figure turned, slowly, unnaturally, like it was a puppet on a string. My blood ran cold. It was a woman, but her face was pale, almost sickly white, and her eyes, I can't even describe them. They were too dark, like there was nothing behind them. Hollow, empty. I felt like I was staring into the void itself. My throat went dry. "Are you okay?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, a horrible, guttural sound escaped. It wasn't human. It sounded like something else, something wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I backed away slowly. I was about to turn and run, but something stopped me. A shadow moved behind her, a dark shape that was too fast, too large to be a person. It seemed to loom over her, and that's when I realized she wasn't alone. I spun around and bolted back to the truck, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My heart was racing. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, but when I turned to look, no one was there. I didn't waste any time. I jumped into the cab, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I threw the truck into gear and sped off down the road. I didn't look back. I couldn't. For the rest of the night, I didn't stop. I drove as fast as I could, my eyes glued to the road ahead. The static on the radio grew louder, almost like it was mocking me. And then, just when I thought I might finally be out of whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into, something strange happened. The road in front of me started to bend. It was as if the highway itself was shifting, twisting like a snake. I could see the lights of the town I was heading toward in the distance, but the road kept changing, looping back on itself. It was like I was going in circles. I kept my foot on the gas, my mind racing. What was going on? Had I hit my head? Was I dreaming? But I knew I wasn't. I could feel the weight of the wheel in my hands, the vibrations of the tires on the road. This was real. I don't know how long I drove like that, The road kept changing, the shadows kept creeping closer, and every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw something following me, something not quite human. That was the last time I drove that stretch of route. I don't know what I saw out there, but I know I'll never forget it. I don't know how many hours passed that night. Time seemed to bend and twist, just like the road I was on. My mind was a blur, and every mile felt like an eternity. I kept my hands tight on the wheel, praying to make it to the next town, but no matter how far I drove, the landscape remained the same, desolate and dark, with nothing but endless stretches of road and shadows that seemed to follow me, growing longer the farther I went. The radio static was unbearable now, louder than ever, like it was trying to drown out my thoughts. My heart pounded in my chest as I flicked the radio dial, hoping to hear anything other than that horrible noise. But all I got was a voice, faint and distant, almost like a whisper. "Turn back." I froze, my stomach churned, and I slammed my fist on the radio. The voice stopped, but the chill it left in my bones didn't. My eyes darted back to the road ahead, and I swear I saw something in the distance. A figure. I wasn't imagining it this time. It was a man standing by the side of the road, his face hidden in shadow. I couldn't take it anymore. I hit the gas, pushing the truck faster, hoping to outrun whatever nightmare I had gotten myself into. But the faster I went, the further the figure seemed to stay ahead of me, like the road itself was playing tricks on me. Finally, just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw the lights of a town up ahead. A real town this time, not one that disappeared as soon as I got close. I let out a sigh of relief and took the exit onto a familiar road. The familiar sight of a diner, a gas station, and a few tired old houses was enough to make me feel like I was back in the real world again. I pulled into the gas station, my hands shaking as I climbed out of the truck. The cold night air hit me, but it felt different now. It felt safe. I didn't care about getting a room. I didn't care about anything but getting off that road. I walked into the gas station, and the clerk gave me a strange look when I walked in. Maybe it was the wild look in my eyes or the way my clothes were disheveled. I wasn't sure. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, a hint of concern in her voice. I gave her a shaky smile. "Maybe I have." I went outside to check my rig, wanting to make sure it was still in one piece. As I walked around to the back of the truck, I froze. There was something on the bumper. A mark, a smear of dark red, almost like blood. I bent down, and as I inspected it closer, I realized it was something else. Something worse. It was a handprint, but not like any handprint I'd ever seen. The fingers were long, twisted, and distorted, almost like they didn't belong to a human at all. I didn't stick around long enough to figure out what it meant. I hurried back into the gas station, paid for some coffee to steady my nerves, and climbed back into my truck. I was done with this road, done with whatever haunted it. I had a new rule now: avoid Route 66 at all costs. I'm not sure what I saw that night. I don't know if it was some kind of ghost, a nightmare, or something even darker that crawls in the shadows of forgotten highways. All I know is that it was real, and as I pulled away from that gas station, I could still feel it watching me. That strange feeling in my gut, the one that tells you you're never really alone, even when you're miles from anyone. I never heard anything about that stretch of road again, but I've heard enough stories from other drivers to know I wasn't the only one. Some roads, they say, are cursed, haunted by things that shouldn't be, and no matter how far you run, they'll always be waiting for you to come back. That was the last time I ever drove that route,